Tennessee does indeed sign David Sanders, the four-star, offensive tackle out of Charlotte. So your thoughts on what David Sanders does to this class?
I think look, I got to be honest with you. I have never been a recruiting guy. Part of it was watching you and Josh Ward cover recruiting in the day. That looks like the worst job that you could ever have. Like, I would rather shovel out septic tanks than have to cover recruiting. It looks horrible. But
it actually is going to be on dirty jobs.
But so if he's good enough that everybody wanted him and Ohio State made a late run to kind of create a negotiation, to me, it's as much about the optics of not losing that guy to Ohio State as anything else. Now, you need a 5-star tackle. You need a guy that Tennessee has been deficient at tackle the last few years. They have. And if there's one weakness, I think I would say under Josh Heupel's time, Darnell Wright got really a lot better his senior year, but Tennessee's been deficient in tackle for a while. So to add the best tackle in the class, I think is massive. To beat out Ohio State in a negotiation from an NIL standpoint, when the last few years it's been Ohio State or Texas that kind of just they can pay more for literally everybody. I think that speaks volumes, and the optics of you landing him instead of Ohio State, I think, is massive. And look, Tennessee, it's 2 years in a row that you're in the blue chip ratio, right? And so you were in the blue chip ratio with or without him, and then you kind of just dropped the cherry on this bad boy by putting the top offensive tackle in the class versus instead of going to Ohio State, he's coming to you. I think it's massive. Now, do I know if he's any good? I have no idea whatsoever, and not a single one of us do. This is why I hate recruiting.
Right. What do you mean by the blue chip ratio? Because I heard you use that on your show. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, Bud Elliott did this with 247 Sports years ago, and I think it started when he was at SB Nation. And so if you go through the history of the national championship, since we have had recruiting rankings, the blue chip ratio is you have more 4 and 5 stars on your roster than 3 stars. One team ever has won a national title while not being in the blue chip ratio, and that team was the Cam Newton-Auburn team. The team they played was Oregon, one of 2 other teams that ever played for the national title who weren't in the blue chip ratio. Tennessee didn't have a class in the blue chip ratio where it was more 4 and 5 than 3 or below since 2019 until last year. And now you're 2 years in a row that you've assigned in the blue chip ratio. And again, unless you're going to get Cam Newton from junior college, if you want to win a national title, you have to be in the blue chip ratio. Tennessee hasn't been. Other schools that played for the title, I think that Washington team was just below TCU, and then Oregon and Auburn. Literally, that's it in the history of college football to even play for a national championship. So for Tennessee, look, I know you're ranked 10th, and it kind of might feel very Butch Jones-esque to be ranked 10th and 7th in the SEC. But if you look at that little number beside that of like the difference between the 5th-ranked team Ohio State and the 10th-ranked team Tennessee is like 1 point out of 100. So it's 1%. So their class is 1% better from the points ranking when you add everything up. I just think this class is great for Tennessee, and then you add David Sanders kind of on top, and you're able to keep him from going to Ohio State. Tennessee is going to be really close to the blue chip ratio this year, maybe in the blue chip ratio. We saw it this year, right? Tennessee's roster looked different against Georgia and Alabama than it has in the past. It wasn't the system got them, or Hendon Hooker came out of nowhere, or Jalen Hyatt just played out of his mind. It wasn't anything like that. The Tennessee roster's good. Is it elite yet? No, but it's good, finally. So now you add another class of 4 and 5 star guys, plus the top tackle in the land to what you've already had. There's going to be a rebuilding process because you're rebuilding on the offensive line and defensive line next year. But you got to feel really good about where Tennessee is from a roster standpoint these days.
Yeah, and I'm gonna play off what you said a little bit. The optics would have been bad, and I'll offer this up too from my many years of recruiting. There are certain guys that if you get, you really can't miss on. Like if you go after some Bison Langs that you think could grow into a player but may not, and he recently transferred out of the program, then you're going to hit or miss on those guys. But when you get the upper tier guys, and I consider Sanders and his rating an upper tier guy, at worst, he's going to be, you would think, a 2-year starter that's good. At best, he's an all-SEC top player. In other words, he's one of those guys that the chances of missing on are about 1 in 10.
Yeah, he's at least going to be a dude, right? Like, so that's you know what I mean? Like, there have been Wanya Morris as a guy that I would point to. He was at least a dude. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know that he was ever elite, but he was a dude. So, and with Sanders, I do think also recruiting services have gotten better at identifying and kind of reading offensive line talent. They're a little bit better at that now than they were probably back then. But you're right. The worst case scenario, as long as this guy's healthy and doesn't have some type of off the field issue, is that he's a starter in the SEC, and you're hoping that you can develop him into becoming an all SEC player and a first round pick.
Well, I do cover recruiting. I share your sentiment of it. I am traumatized. Part of it is, funny enough, recruiting to me is.
I got a twitch, actually.
Well, recruiting to me, I just want to point this out. It's very similar to free agency in the NFL. Well, I don't know if you know, I live in the D.C. area, and I lived through there during the Dan Snyder years, and Washington felt they won the Super Bowl every year because of their free agent success, and they never won a Super Bowl. It came close. But how much pressure is on Josh Heupel with a guy like David Sanders for this reason? I don't think it's any secret that Tennessee has failed miserably in terms of signing high school offensive linemen under Josh Heupel to this point. If David Sanders doesn't work out, I mean, does that mean it's time to cut bait with Glenn Ellerbe?
Well, I don't know that it's time to cut bait with Glenn Ellerbe. Here's the concern, right? Anytime you run any kind of veer, you're not running a real NFL system, and so can you develop a guy for the National Football League? That's the concern that I would have. And I don't know that Glenn Ellerbe is making or breaking that necessarily. So I don't know how much of that's on Glenn Ellerbe versus that's on the system, right? So, like, I mean, look at the high school teams that have run beer over the years. Gibbs, when they ran beer, right? When Ollie Lynn was there. So it's you're just kind of getting in the way of a guy. You're not actually pushing him off the block or taking that step play side and hitting the guy that's in front of you. I guess it's not as much of that. Or there's a little bit more variation this year to what they do. I would start. To me, the question that I would ask is Glenn Ellerbe good enough at developing them? I would ask the question, can this system develop offensive linemen, period, or do you just need to recruit to this system? And that means you're never going to have an elite offensive line because you're always recruiting to the system. But I think the rest of that, a lot of it comes down to strength and conditioning coach is going to play a large part in that. I think one of the reasons Tennessee struggled, especially under Derek Dooley on the offensive line once Sam Pittman left, I remember having one player showed up in the studio one day, and he's talking to me and Jimmy Hyams in the sports office, and he was talking about at that time. I'll just say it. I think it was a former player who is now currently a sports radio host, and not this city, but in this state, if you know what I'm talking about. And he said Marcus Jackson, a freshman, was the strongest guy on the team, benching 415. At the time, I was benching 315 as a 35-year-old man. You know what I mean? Like that's not okay. You know what I mean? That your strongest guy is doing 415. So I think that I would look at the strength and conditioning if it's not Glenn Ellerbe, because I think Glenn Ellerbe's coaching to the system very well, but it's a weird system, and I don't know that this system is going to work for everybody. And I don't know that this system necessarily develops players for the National Football League. And if that ever becomes a problem, that would be the bigger question that I have is, does Josh Heupel have to adjust what he does up front?
Dave, before you jump in, I just have to point out, it's also true that Derek Dooley didn't win a whole class without signing an offensive line, which is still the most unheard of thing ever done in the history of college football recruiting.
Okay, dead serious, right? That's happening on that signing day. Josh Ward is on the air with me going off about, oh, this is bad. This is really bad. He didn't sign a single lineman. The level of cursing that Josh received in DMs and on social media for pointing that out, the things that people said to him were incredible. I also think so. Dooley also brought in this random strength and conditioning guy that wanted to. We're going to do like an MMA focus, and so they took out a lot of the heavy weights and put in TRX bands and a UFC cage. So it's like, what are you? So you're doing push-ups? That's what you're going to do to get your linemen strong? Come on, and Bama, and then so you would see it, right? Like we get to media days, Bama would have a 290-pound defensive end, a guy about Tyree West size as their defensive end. Tennessee would roll some 250-pound guy up there, and I'm like, it's probably not going to go well this year, boys.
Yep. We're going to talk about another transfer that is leaving Tennessee's football program, and he happens to play wide receiver. But we were talking to Jimmy Hyams about this yesterday, strictly in terms of high school talent, whether it's evaluating or developing or probably a little bit of both. Are you more concerned about the offensive line or the receivers? Not to say they can't be supplemented with NIL and not to lose the forest from the trees because they are playing for a national championship. But what are you more concerned about as we look at the way this roster is developed? Offensive line or wide receiver?
I would wide receiver, and I don't think it's the players. Like I've watched Chris Brazzell be good, right? So if Chris Brazzell is good at Tulane and he's not good at Tennessee, that's not a Chris Brazzell problem to me.
Well, I think I'm talking about just high school recruits.
The high school recruits, I think you're getting good enough talent. I think they're poorly coached right now. I think so. A lot of what they're trying to do on the offensive, on the wide receiver court, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You're running guys into space, and that are into defenders instead of trying to. Where's the open space? Attack the open space with your wide receivers. Brew McCoy was amazing, right? So and you're right. They haven't brought in I guess they have with Matthews, but they haven't used him a ton. But if you're not using Brew McCoy, who I watched be amazing in the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon, if you're not using Chris Brazzell, who I watched be fantastic at Tulane, some of that's on Nico this year because Nico, those are guys that if they're in single coverage, you throw a ball up and let them make a play, and Nico didn't get comfortable with that until the Vandy game, it seemed like. But I think Tennessee's wide receivers have been pretty poorly coached so far. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me why they're doing the things that they're doing. And also, maybe part of that is I'm a Giants fan, and I see Jalen Hyatt flat can't play football. Cannot. You know what I mean? Is not capable of playing at an NFL level. He's not good enough. And so I think they need to get back to running to grass like Bryles did. And instead, it seems like they have certain routes that they have to do. They're all super long developing. And I don't know that it's necessarily the individual position coaching that's bad, but the way the wide receivers are being used is not good enough, and they've got to get better with it during this offseason. Part of that might be Joey Halsley's new. Part of, you know what I mean? Like he's even talked about the growing pains he's dealt with stepping into that position for Alex Golish. Part of that might be Heupel trying to make sure his wide receivers run the full route tree and all of that stuff. But I don't think it's the players, right? Again, because are most of those guys elite from high school? No, but I think they're good enough. And you see the open spaces on the field you could attack with your wide receivers, and Tennessee doesn't do it. And that's why everybody did the same thing for Tennessee outside of a couple of teams that just always run the exact same sits. Like Clark Lee runs what Clark Lee runs. He ain't changing for nobody. But doing that umbrella with 4 players over the top, 10, 12 yards off the ball, you beat them to death with tunnel screens and little smoke routes and things like that until they get out of it, and then you can beat them deep. Tennessee didn't. They just kept trying to beat everybody deep, and it didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It's like a basketball team that wants to shoot threes, so the opponent tries to pressure the perimeter. You know what you do? You dribble past them and hit a bunch of layups, and then they're going to back off and leave you open for your threes. So I think it's a way that the receivers are used more than the players themselves. I don't know that the high school talent has been elite that they brought in, but I think they're good enough. But if the guys who from the transfer portal are elite don't get used well, why would I expect the high school guys to get used well?
David Sanders said that Josh Heupel told him that he was the leader of this class. Was that just coach speak? Also, our poll question that is up now is getting David Sanders was a must or gravy. We'll ask Will both of those questions. 30 seconds from Banks and Jones. Why Banks and Jones? Well, it's because they're Tennessee's trial attorney. You can play to win with Banks and Jones because they'll go to trial. You've heard of other lawyers. They say they'll go to trial and fight for you. They won't. They just want to settle. That's the easiest way out. Well, that's not Banks and Jones, led by T. Scott Jones. They won't settle. They'll go to trial for you. Tennessee's trial attorney. They play to win. Truly Tennessee's trial attorney when it comes to criminal defense or personal injury. Why settle? It's Banks and Jones. T. Scott Jones. Banks and All right, sir. A poll question is this: David Sanders was a must or gravy? A must 70%, gravy 30%. I'm still thinking on that one. I don't have my answer, so I'm going to throw it to you first, Will.
Gravy. I think you didn't have to have him. I mean, it's fantastic. You definitely want him if you can have him. It's a different day and age, right? Like it's back in the day. If your kid didn't get enough nutrients from school lunch, you were in trouble. And then we got Flintstone vitamins, and you can supplement. So it's you have the transfer portal that's there, and Tennessee has missed in the transfer portal, but Tennessee's hit at a pretty darn high clip compared to the rest of the teams in college football and in the SEC. You can go get another tackle. You don't want to though, because how you build championship teams is by recruiting in high school and developing those players. Otherwise, Lane Kiffin would be winning championships right now, right? But you don't have to have literally anybody in football anymore from a recruiting standpoint, because you can go find another guy who can be good at that position through the transfer portal.
Well, wait, to play devil's advocate, you wouldn't have called Nico Gravy.
I think you needed a quarterback. It didn't have to be Nico. I mean, if it ended up being Jackson Arnold or somebody like that, I think it would have been, you'd have been okay. You needed a quarterback. But if you didn't have a quarterback, you needed to go to the transfer portal and go get a quarterback. Nico, it has not gone as well as I thought it was going to for Nico this year. Like, I understand why when I was thinking, when I was hearing that, hey, maybe Joe Milton doesn't want to play football right now. And I was like, well, why don't you just play Nico? He's looked like, just throw him out there and figure out what you can figure out. And I kept hearing he's not ready. Now I see it, right? Like, there's still some things that he's developing, and this is kind of what you get from most pro-style passers. If you look at Matt Ryan, Andrew Luck, if you look at Josh Allen, if you look pretty much anybody in the NFL not named Peyton Manning or Tua, their second year, they weren't that great as a pocket passer. But you could have gotten someone else besides Nico. It's just the hype, the lore of Nico is kind of awesome, but it's not like that's translated to the field particularly well. Was he a top 7 quarterback in the SEC this year? Because I would say probably not. I have high expectations for him. I see the talent. But you could have had somebody else in that position, even though you want to have Nico.
Yeah, I remember I was the guy, and I'm sorry, I'll turn it to you, Caleb, but I was the guy who said, play him last year. And then somebody finally reached out to me and said, this is what he sounds like when he calls plays. This was after, but this was during September. They said he'd come to the play. And he just was uncertain about calling a lot of things. So in retrospect, I think I was wrong. I don't think he was ready to play until maybe late in the year. Caleb?
To y'all's point, though, you mentioned him. Well, Jackson Arnold just hit the transfer portal, as did Connor Wegman, standing out because Connor Wegman said he wants to go play for a college football playoff contender, which is a giant middle finger to Texas A&M, saying that he doesn't think they'll be there next year. I kind of see, I don't know how you guys see it, but I get your point, Will, but I do somewhat see David Sanders as a must. Only because Tennessee's failed so miserably with the offensive linemen they've been scouting so far to this point. So they needed a guy that's a surefire hit, which I think Sanders is.
How did they miss on ability, or did they miss on the type of dude they brought in?
And on offensive line?
Offensive tackle specifically.
I think they have missed because you had Georgia and Alabama getting the pick of the litter. And then you have to compete with everybody else, and then you've got a hard sell. I think Tennessee has, as this is just my thought and want more your thoughts than mine, but I think they've kind of topped the hill, so to speak, of you can walk into any living room and have a pretty good shot nowadays. Now, I don't think that was the case, which is why I just throw Bison Lang under the bus again, which is why they had to settle for Bison Lang. I saw that kid. I saw the tape of him, and I was like, yeah, I remember when it happened. I was like, we can talk about it on the show, but that kid's not going to be a high-level player. At best, he's going to play his senior year, and that's it.
Yeah. Caleb, what do you think? Do you think, because I look at John Campbell, I think there's a reason other teams wanted John Campbell. He went to Miami. I think John Campbell's maybe just a little casual of a dude. You know what I mean? I think Lance Hurd is looking at himself not as a businessman, but as a businessman, if we can paraphrase Jay-Z. So he dealt with injury in fall camp, and I'm not playing if I got any level. Just he's not going to play if he deals with injury, and then he ends up out of shape, and it takes him a while to get back into shape. So I think those guys are good enough athletes. I question, like, again, there's a reason all those defensive players left because of what Tennessee paid John Campbell, right? They were like, I'm a lot better than this guy, and you're paying him, and I'm all in, and he's not, and you're paying him. A lot of people were upset with that. Lance Hurd hasn't panned out like you'd hope that he would, but I think those guys are good enough athletically to be what you need them to be, and they did get better down the stretch, I would say.